Good evening everyone, and thank you very much for coming here tonight. My name is Anna Janewski. I'm the Associate Curator at the Media and Performance Art Department here at MoMA. Together with my colleagues from the department, we are really thrilled to host tonight's talk, which is a part of AFTERLIVES, the Persystem of Performance. Thank you to Andre Lepecki and Adrian Hitfield. We have had the opportunity to be really in the company of really amazing thinkers and peers and to engage in very passionate and, I think, really shifting discussions about performance and the afterlives of performance. And just to remind you, yesterday Fred Moten talk. Of course, we are also thrilled that Andre and Adrian have collaborated with other organizations and institutions such FIAF, the French Institute, and the Crossing the Line Festival, and we'd like to thank Lily Chopra and Simon Dove, and also with the Columbia University School of Art. In that case, we would like to thank Carol Becker. We are very proud tonight to host the talk of Lynn Hixson and Matthew Goulish, the two amazing co-founders of Goat of Islands and Every House Has a Door, the most challenging and interesting theater groups. So I would like, it will be very short because we have also at 7:30 the Caitlin Stewart talk, and I would like to welcome with me Simon Dove, one of the co-curator of Crossing the Line Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, I'm Simon Dove. I'm one of the co-curators, as you heard, of Crossing the Line. And I'm really happy to welcome you here. I'm calling it this afternoon. It's kind of verging on the evening, but welcoming you this afternoon. We're really grateful to the fabulous team at MoMA's Department of Performance and Media and Performance Art. Stuart, Anna, you just met Thomas, Martha. They've been great collaborators. And they're amazing partners for us on this AFTERLIVES project that Andre and Adrian have put together. For Crossing the Line, this kind of reflective and provocative event really explores the residual impact of performance, and that, I think, is really critical and germane to the whole notion of what Crossing the Line as a festival is trying to do. So I thought I'd just give you a very brief context for this event and how it relates to the festival more broadly. Crossing the Line was started in 2007 by Lily Chopra, who's the artistic director at the French Institute. And it was really conceived as a platform for what I guess you would call interdisciplinary or hybrid work. In 2007, there was a lot of this work beginning to emerge, and she was concerned that it didn't seem to be fitting into the kind of cultural institutions here in New York. It was work that really she felt needed to be seen and wasn't being seen enough. As artists, we're evolving new work and working practices that simply did not fit old genre-specific definitions or even the architectural propositions of arts institutions. They clearly needed a platform that could be as flexible and adaptable as the work itself. In order to deliver such a festival, FIAF really developed partnerships of all kinds in order to achieve the optimum context to both present the work and the artist. From public parks and streets to department store windows, Times Squares, Jumbotron screens, and even to galleries, theaters, and even occasionally arts venues themselves. And we worked really across all 5 boroughs, trying to ensure that this work started to develop its kind of connections to the fabric of the culture of the city. And just as artists have evolved their approach, so has the festival, with the program consciously eschewing the idea of a theme or a focus, and instead building a program of work by artists who offer us a unique perspective on the world we inhabit and who are finding potent means to engage us with their ideas. So content, or perhaps what you might call the artist's intention, drove the curatorial choices, and not in any way the form or the forms that those works took. Yet this still represents a significant challenge in the way the work is engaged with or even discussed. There still seems to be a reliance on the idea that genres determined in the past should be used as, in some way, an appropriate frame to talk about the work of the present, let alone the future. But how does knowing if what you're going to see is a dance performance or a theater piece shape the way you engage with the work itself? Or even worse, how does it even determine whether you go or not? If you know an artist has a formal training in visual art yet makes music, how does that change the way or what you hear and the way you listen? Every year, for instance, we battle with the media, who it seems can only review something if they know before it happens what it's going to be. They call us and say, is this a dance event or a theater event? And we say, well, it's both, but actually it's neither. So often it really gets overlooked. Fortunately, the persistence of performance, as we know, does not rely on being documented by a newspaper of record. The gentle or sometimes even profound shifts in someone's perception or imagination as a result of engaging with performance are really unmeasurable, undocumentable, and certainly unarchivable, yet absolutely critical to the way artists help us navigate our world. For us, artists perhaps more so than ever before are a critical part of maintaining and developing a healthy society, one that questions, investigates, and explores. We clearly need a new or perhaps just a more precise vocabulary, as well as more diverse ways of talking about performance and its effects, a language that perhaps can help us connect us more directly to what it proposes or offers, as well as to the transformations it engenders, a language, in effect, that helps us recognize the real value of performance. So I'm delighted to hand over now to Andre, who will introduce Lynn and Matthew. What I just want to say is Andre's biography is in your program notes, so you can read it in full. For me, he's perhaps one of the most perceptive and profound thinkers about dance and performance that I know. And he's also a fabulous guy. Andre.
Thank you so much. I don't know what to say. Okay, I'll be very brief in introducing Lynn Hixson and Matthew Goulish. And I'd like to do that on behalf also of Adrian Heathfield. And also I'm thanking, on your behalf as well, both of us together, thanking Simon and Lily and Anna, MoMA, FIAF, and Crossing the Line, and Columbia University as well, in helping and gathering this, all the forces and resources that are needed to bring this into place. So, well, I'm not going to take too long because we're here to listen to Matthew and Lynn. But it is important, I think, just to emphasize that in the 1990s, as a kind of rearticulation of what dance and choreography could be, that was taking place mostly in the European continent at the time, sometime between 1993 and 1996, something like that, in which the first works of Jérôme Bel, Xavier Leroy, Boris Charmatz, Esther Solomon were being presented. One of the things that was taking place at the time there was this very strong conversation with a few groups, theater groups, which is interesting for dance. Like the articulation was not necessarily with performance art or visual arts, but with theater. But a very specific theater groups that were coming out from the US. And one of them was Goat Island, that both Lynn and Matthew co-founded in the late 80s. And so it was always intriguing to go to these European festivals, dance festivals, right? And find the presence of Lynn and Matthew and the actors that they were bringing together, particularly because it seems to me that the kind of theater that we're proposing it was a theater that was deeply invested in movement, but also deeply invested in the kind of potential kinesthetic capacity of words to create something else into the world. And I feel like in thinking about this notion of persistence of performance, one of the things that I think it's important for us to think about is the force or the power of language. And yesterday we had this event, which was Fred Moten on this podium delivering his lecture, which is always like somewhere between philosophy and singing, for me at least, right? In which you capture something, you don't capture something else, but you just follow the tune, and then we wake up the next day and you're just like, oh, I'm here listening to Fred, right? And the same kind of thing seemed to happen a little bit, for me at least, with the theater of Go Thailand. And then in the 2008, I guess, when both of you formed Every House Has a Door, which again like brings back this notion, this poetic or biopoetic power of language. So with that said, I was thinking about how you define every house as a door by saying that every house creates performances in which the subject remains largely absented from the finished work. So I feel like tonight, perhaps, we're going to see just another reiteration of that house without an end. And in a way, like, goes back to the notion of persistence. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and it's a joy to have you here. Thank you.
I delight in the palpable, imaginable, visitable past, in the nearer distances and clearer mysteries, the marks and signs of a world we may reach over to, as by making a long arm, we grasp an object at the other end of our own table. The table is the one, the common expanse, and where we lean, so stretching, we find it firm and continuous. That, to my imagination, is the past fragrant of all, or of almost all, the poetry of the thing outlived and lost and gone, and yet in which the precious element of closeness, telling so of connections, but tasting so of differences, remains appreciable.
Our lecture today issues from these three sentences, with their attention to the nuance of time passing. We have our eyes on the phrase, the poetry of the thing outlived.
Perhaps in the work of our performance collective, Every House Has a Door, this phrase defines a pertinent quality or fragrance of our subject, whatever it is. For a time, our lives and the life of our subject proceeded contiguously. Now our subject has departed, yet we continue. As we live, we outlive. Some of you who are still young may recall our subject as fact, but not as poetry. Can we contrive a performance, an invented machine of time that makes that poetry present again? A poetics of the thing outlived.
By a poetics, we mean a set of qualities of creation, relations between observer and observed, aspects we do not invent but try to articulate. Some have been shown to us by our teachers. Henry James's senses of fragrance and taste convinced him of the world's fugitive presentness, yet overflowed the convictions of knowledge into the formations of poetry. We begin with opposites in order to destabilize them, in order to start, as they say, somewhere, if we may be excused the antithesis. I think about an equation proposed in 1859 between rhetoric or eloquence and poetry.
Poetry and eloquence are, both alike, the expression of utterance of feeling. But if we may be excused the antithesis, we should say that eloquence is heard. Poetry is overheard. Eloquence supposes an audience. The peculiarity of poetry appears to us to lie in the poet's utter unconsciousness of a listener. Poetry is feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude and embodying itself in symbols which are the nearest possible representations of the feeling, in the exact shape in which it exists in the poet's mind. Eloquence is feeling pouring itself out to other minds, courting their sympathy or endeavoring to influence their belief or move them to passion or to action.
Does poetry then result from an unintended audience?
Is audience the word for accidental entity overhearing the speech of solitude? What purpose does such speech serve, if not to court sympathy or convince, not to move to action, then to describe, to render undeniable, to let truth happen?
This preamble of definition might remind us that all language must navigate rhetorical conventions, the laws of eloquence, so called, even in order to reject them or to circulate outside of them, even when speaking only to oneself, if that is possible, confessing itself to itself. If I say it is possible, then I say poetry begins when another apprehends that solitary speech. Poetry marks that moment when two replaces one as the smallest unit of humanity.
Can we assemble a poetics of the conditions of such speech acts coming into existence? Can we begin this way, replacing I with we?
Such a collective apprehension of time introduces a second idea, recognized here in its most concise expression.
A sentence means that there is a future.
Shall we interpret this as saying, if a sentence, then a future? The existence of one indicates the other, a simple index. Or does a sentence produce a future? What is the relation between a future and the future? Does that particular future that the sentence means lie outside of its intent, a blind spot? Or is it the remainder of circumstance that it hopes to outlive? I write these words that they may be heard and heard again one day.
Can we substitute for sentence a small, whole increment of what we have come to call performance?
We consider these questions with two preliminary concepts in mind: the concept of the past and the concept of the future. We approach them with this found poetics, language less to express our thoughts than to awaken them.
She walks into the room carrying a pile of newspapers and lays them on the floor. On her knees, she shapes the newspapers into a map. She reads, speaks, and moves her body in response to the news.
One interesting thing about the whole area of the Persian Gulf and the moving in to Afghanistan is that the Arab continent is a separate continental plate, and it's drifting. Iran, the long...
A projected slide on the back wall interrupts her words. She moves to the side of the room. Motionless, she faces the audience. February 11th, 1989, Simone Forti. Says the slide and then disappears. She returns to the floor and continues where she left off.
Coastline on the Gulf, but up here on Afghanistan, and the pressure builds up on these mountains. And these are the mountains that the Russians moved across.
She stops abruptly, and when she continues, it will not be to continue this, but to enact another beginning. Selma Banish has completed the beginning, the begins, our performance, 9 Beginnings, Chicago. We have taken it from choreographer Simone Forti's news animation improvisations, presented at Randolph Street Gallery on February 11th, 1989. Forti describes the process of performing these improvisations.
Somewhere along the way, I would get the idea for what topic I was going to start with. As the lights came on, I would be shaping the papers around on the floor, making them into maps. I would start talking and animating the human dramas above ground, interwoven with the seismic, tectonic dramas below.
In our performance, Selma does not walk into a dark room and find a topic to address on the way. Selma performs the exact words Forti spoke on February 11th. For these words, said in 1989 and spoken now in 2014, disturb me. They are too familiar, too commonplace, too day-to-day. When the performance is interrupted by the announcement of the date and artist's name, Selma stands motionless in order to construct a gap. It is in this pause and separation that Forti's performance can begin to haunt ours. After this moment, Forti's words become distant and prophetic, slightly ahead of and slightly behind the now. This fracture opens up a system of presence that operates like connective tissue. Forti's remoteness comes into view, but so does the length of her reach. It crosses time and disrupts the proper order of the present.
Randolph Street Gallery, an artist-run space, existed from 1979 to 1998. One entered into a large gallery space with offices at the end. A second room, long and narrow, accessed through doors on either end of the long wall at the left as one entered the gallery, hosted performances. The archive describes it as a laboratory for new forms, new thought, and new ways to distribute art in the world. I remember that as true.
We composed the performance 9 Begin in Chicago in response to the Randolph Street Gallery archives held at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It wove the beginnings of 9 performances by 9 different artists or groups, 9 time-delayed teachers imparting lessons outside of the classroom. The performances documented on video all happened in the same narrow room at 756 North Milwaukee. The room had an uneven wood floor, below which trains ran audibly from time to time. Trains today called Blue Line, in those days called O'Hare Congress. Randolph Street Gallery offered a meeting place where people gathered to experience the results of diligent and intelligent curatorial practice, along with a certain uncontainable edge of roughness.
Why not just play the tapes in public? A journalist asked me this. Why enact the performances? I told him there is too much noise in the system of those videos, too much extraneous information. In the live event, we've learned how to filter through attention and the empathy of physical proximity. The body shrinks in the visual field, but in the room it swells and attracts. Our cameras cannot select as well as our brains. To enact, to reenact, frames and focuses. It makes a claim to what is important.
Those lockdown camera documentation tapes nearly always captured, as if by accident, a pre-show announcement by a host. This video marginalia for us provided the most potent dose of the poetry of those times, and we sought a way to include one of them in 9 Beginnings. Mary Jo Schnell, a member of the performance committee, made the announcement that impressed us the most, introducing the evening of May 23, 1992. The sheer immensity of her speech mesmerized us. It lasted 7.5 minutes, longer in fact, since it commenced already in progress at the start of the tape. We decided that Matthew, as dramaturg, would perform it in its entirety. It seemed crucial that we find the same t-shirt for him to wear that Mary Jo wore on that hot May evening. We went to the source and tracked down Mary Jo, now interim executive director of the Out Center. She revealed that she kept all the t-shirts from those days in archival boxes. I have always believed that when making a performance, I will find what I need close at hand or not at all. So Matthew re-performed the entire announcement in the exact Lesbians Who Kill t-shirt from 1992. Here for you is a live edited version.
One, in your program notes, we note to please, if you're interested in being informed of upcoming events, sign up for our mailing list and you'll be kept apprised of upcoming events and programming here at Randolph Street Gallery. There is a mailing list at the front desk where you purchased your ticket. There is also a red sheet of paper. It's about Randolph Street Gallery membership. In order for us to continue to present programs such as the one you're going to see tonight and hopefully more, we are in need of your support. More and more, as I'm sure you all know, the governmental funding for the arts.
Fast forward 1 minute.
We'll be finishing out our season with, which is through June. Then we'll start up again in September. There are some events taking place this summer, so if you are on the mailing list now, you'll be notified of those. This weekend is the first weekend of 4 for the 3rd annual In Through the Outdoor series, which I'm very happy has lasted this long and continues to develop. There are, after this weekend, next weekend, is video work being done by lesbians, queers, homosexies, however you want to claim those labels. The first night, Friday night, is a piece by Cecilia Doherty. She's a video artist from San Francisco who has recently completed a piece called The Coal Miner's Granddaughter. It's done with a Fisher-Price camera. It's pixel vision.
Fast forward 1 minute.
4 performances by Pomo Afro Homos, postmodern African-American homosexuals. They'll be doing their piece, Fierce Love, and they've been all over the country and are actually at this point in Europe now with this piece, and it's received much critical acclaim. We're also very happy that they could be participating in the series as well. More information on each of those weekends in the calendar, please help yourself. Getting back to this weekend and tonight. There's so much work being done in performance art in Chicago, and specifically for this series, gay and lesbian, queer, bi, and on in a wonderful way. There's much work being done. We did a call for submissions for this weekend, and we had 2 guest jurors who looked at the work and programmed this weekend's performance artists. Steve Lafreniere, who was one of the main persons behind Spew the Homographic Convergence, which was part of last year's series. If you were here, you know what I'm talking about. If not, you really missed something. And Iris Moore, who has performed here in the past, and actually, she will be performing at Club Lower Links, splitting the bill with Lawrence Steger in June, Fridays and Saturdays in June. Please look it up. Her work is really strong, really interesting. She's with us here tonight, here.
Fast forward 1 minute.
After those three, we will take a 10-minute intermission. The bar will be open. The doors will be open. We'll get some air going through here. So you can get up, stretch your legs, but I'll let you know when that is. So without further ado, welcome. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we'll start the evening, please.
Known but forgotten, unknown but recognized. They speak our minds now. We speak as them as they speak for us. Voices muted by time, by our lack of diligence. We resolve to keep them before us. We assemble their beginnings into a new composition. It flows in its own way like a meandering tributary of echoes and associations. The voices carry across near distances, the passages of time that we can reach across and try our best to touch in a performance as a form of recovery, declaring a visible difference between the dancer and the dance.
Any analysis of the reasons for the end of Randolph Street Gallery lies beyond the scope of this lecture. It folded at a time we can, with hindsight, recognize as a turning point, from aspirations of collectivity and collective responsibility with all the accompanying fraught conflicts, to a time of forced atomization, of celebrating the adventures of individualism and the loose friendships of arrangements over groups, wandering in a strange wilderness in which no one is ever really alone or left alone for long. I recall the belief, more prominent then, that the non-profit sector can keep in check the excesses of the free market, a belief that assumes an unassailable partition between the two. Much has been gained and much has been lost, and of the things lost, that room, as a physical presence and a condition, it allowed certain types of movement to emerge, movement we have tried to study.
How does a room obtain an afterlife? Must it die to get there? An uneven floor, patched and painted walls, the likeness of a body. We wrench souls from this body and lure them into our bodies. The soul makes a journey from this room, not toward abstraction, but toward embodiment, in a concrete word that forms a sentence, that forms a performance. A performance means there is a future. We move cautiously to understanding. We yearn for an understanding, a significance that is just a little beyond both our theories and our fears. We feel the visitable past as strange and familiar. We look for moments when the scales of past, present, and future hang with the right evenness. We seek the particular afternoon light that rests clearer than the light more protected by the dignity of history.
We cannot think without recourse to abstraction. Because of this, we must remain vigilant in critically revising our modes of abstraction. Let us consider this the work of philosophy, to act as a critic of abstraction. Let us propose a parallel with the work of performance as we try to practice it. We consider performance that mode of presentation that makes relations apparent before us. In doing so, it places us as audience in a condition of exposure to those relations that were there from the beginning, but that we found ourselves unable to see or unwilling to acknowledge. What we allow ourselves to see in what we look at depends on the abstract definition that we bring to bear on the object before us. We may observe a thing without attending to it. Like Adam in the garden, we try to see the animal, to attend to it before we give it a name. Performance as we want it makes relations apparent in time. We may even say it makes time apparent. Classical definitions regard time as a common field in which all things that age do so equally. Another hypothesis, new in the year 1925 and perhaps still new 90 years later, holds the two objects in motion relative to one another utilize meanings of space and of time which are not identical. Time, by this definition, measures difference. It concerns degrees of motion and rest. If two objects are mutually at rest, they are utilizing the same meanings of space and of time. If in relative motion, the spaces and times differ. We understand time as a relation between two objects, two being the smallest unit, once again, for making sense of the universe. We understand this relation to be the meaning of the word relativity. Time passes at one rate for an object in motion and another for an object at rest. It follows that if we can conceive a body at one stage of its life history as in motion relatively to itself at another stage, then the body at these two stages is utilizing diverse meanings of space and correlatively diverse meanings of time. That is to say that one object over its lifespan experiences as many forms of time passing as it has relative rates of motion or rest. The classical presupposition of a definite present instant at which all matter is simultaneously real fractures and multiplies. These two versions of time as a common field or as a measure of a diversity of differences in motion contradict one another. We cannot hold to both of them at once. We must choose, and in choosing adjust our worldview accordingly, as the definition relates to all events. When I say performance makes time apparent, I mean that in its demonstrations of motion and rest, performance operates as a proof of time's diversity. Each instance of a diverse meaning of time taken alone may seem insignificant, yet diverse meanings of time as a concept remains undeniably significant. Philosophy finds its currency in those questions that appear inconsequential until experience reveals them to be fundamental. It remains to be seen how diverse meanings of time will affect the practice of our collaboration, but it must be understood as central to it. Any notion of enduring practice must commence from the concept of diverse meanings of time. It must ask the question, what do we can we share? We apprehend one another, and in doing so, loosen from our streams. Can we advance in parallel collective motion? If so, we can do so only through appealing to an extended act of labor, of crafting our communion, a composed event that renders time mutual and shareable. This might be philosophy's way of saying that community as we need it follows from acknowledging that what we have in common is not discovered, but constructed, uncovered, and allowed in a texture of time that gathers our differences.
Often, at the end of the day, when I am tired, my life seems to turn into a movie. I mean, my real day moves into my real evening, but also moves away from me enough to be strange and a movie. It has by then become so complicated, so hard to understand, that I want to watch a movie made for TV, which will be simple and easy to understand, even if it involves disaster or disease. It will skip over so much. It will skip over all the complications, knowing we will understand, so that major events will happen abruptly. The pattern is the opposite when making a performance. I do not trust the process of creating until I reach the place of disorientation and the not known, where the fixed, held, and inherited dissolve and a future calls. It is not easy to reach this state, and it is always done in the company of others. We deliberately assemble a temporary community. We know that these individuals will force an interruption to our habits. We have convened an intergenerational collaborative team to create our new performance. The senior member, the poet Jay Wright, celebrated his 80th birthday this past May. The youngest member, conceptual costume designer Sky Cubicub, will celebrate her 24th in October. A constellation of ages across 6 decades scatter the 4 performers in their 30s and 40s, a dramaturg in his 50s, and a director in her 60s. We have come to understand this community according to the terms with which Leela Gandhi writes about the inner life of democracy. She understands democracy as a shared art of living. She presents a version of democracy defined by inconsequentialism. This lost tradition of global democratic thought dedicates itself to an ethics of undoing, falling short, and making oneself less rather than more. It celebrates self-reduction in forms serious as well as playful and essential and superfluous. Gandhi writes about the 1946 mutiny by sailors of the Royal Indian Navy on the threshold of Indian independence. She studied the archival records of the trial by a commission of inquiry, and she relates her disappointment in discovering the trivialities of the testimonies. Mutineers insisted that their essential demand concerned the palate. Complaints range from too much ghee in the curry to poor food presentation. While supporters beyond the courtroom waited for a verdict, litigators and witnesses at the inquiry engaged in animated conversation about the culinary arts, regional preferences, and recipes. Notwithstanding ample evidence for the nationalist dismissal of the mutiny as an event of no consequence, mutineers hinted at the revolutionary worth of their own apparent self-trivialization. In which disciplinary and semantic field might their inconsequentiality become legible as a motivated practice? That is, as something possessing its own content and intent, rather than as a privation of some other set of values. What sort of real and imagined, moral or political worth obtains from a principled resistance to the abstract laws of consequence? Across all these diverse conceptual and historical registers, ethical and political inconsequentialism can be summarized as a force of interruption in the worldly drama of repetition, reproduction, and duplication, so that newness might re-enter the world. Newness achieves its temporal significance as an event that renders the future once again an open question, liberated from causality as also from utopian overdetermination. Thus conceived minimally as a procedure that enforces hospitality upon the future, or as one that reopens the future, newness certainly prevents the foreclosure of our best dreams. The reopening of the future is contingent upon the reopening of the present. A painful replacement of the habits of being for the muddle of becoming, which proceeds as the work of unworking or as a direction. It is this direction I seek as a director in the profound inconsequence of the work of performance, liberated through primary disorientation.
I saw Jesse Malmed at a gallery opening. In this remembered dialogue, Lynn will read the part of Jesse, and I will read the part of myself.
So did that thing that I tried to make happen on the internet actually happen or have any effect at all?
Jesse, are you speaking in code?
That means no.
Jesse explained that he had dreamed that I had for years kept secret my employment as a Sports Illustrated writer. He woke up and decided to tweet the news. Any such act of creative disorientation fills Jesse with profound tranquility. He would then measure the reaction when he next met me by the number of people who had inquired about my sports journalist life and Jesse's outing me. I told him that nobody had mentioned it.
I guess I don't have as many followers as I thought.
Or any who recognized my name. There followed this exchange a silent moment of mutual dejection.
Here's something. I discovered I can set my computer to auto-send an email in 6 months. So when I have a good idea for a collaboration that I'm too busy for right now, I write it up and set it to send to the other person in 6 months from now. I figure I'll have enough time then. Also, I will have forgotten about it, so the person will respond and I'll be like, "What are you talking about?"
The conversation reminded me of the boomlet in online profile management services that commence after death. One of these, Dead Man's Switch, allows you to prepare an email for posthumous distribution. The service regularly confirms that you are alive. If they receive no response after 3 attempts, they hit send. The next day, I joined Twitter in order to read Jesse's dream tweet.
If Google Alerts / social media do their jobs, this is how I tell Matthew Goulish that I had a dream where he wrote for Sports Illustrated.
I imagined my email response. Dear Jesse, if you are reading this, it's because I am dead. Let us take this as an opportunity for a thought experiment. Suppose for the last 20 years of my life, I sustained a secret career with Sports Illustrated, covering the NBA. Would writing be the word? A text box with the note, add content here, content to appropriate something appropriate. Not every penalty warrants a free throw. Nobody understands that better than I now that I have permanently fouled out of the game. Bad at Sports Illustrated, as it were. It reminds me of something you said once.
That they call them paintings instead of painteds is all we have to know about how things can live past the lives of their makers in their makings.
Too true. The demands of a double life would explain the increased spottiness of my performance career and the generally erratic output of my later writing. But here's the question. Would it prove the person on stage was a distortion? That there was always more to me, is always more to everyone than that? Yours sincerely, from the afterlife.
Through a moment of infinite density, I recognize a radiant corruption that serves as a cradle for my emptiness. I have become attuned to the disappearance of all things and of myself, and to that purely present content that nurtures the sheer fact of being.
Jay Wright was born in 1935 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His distinctions include a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Before Columbus Foundation and being the first African American writer to receive Yale University's Bowling Prize in Poetry. His writing uncovers the dense weave of West African mythology, numbers theory, post-colonial American vernaculars, quantum physics, and the vast silences of meditation. Wright constructs the universe of words that makes the interplay of these sources apparent. In May 2014, I wrote to Mr. Wright to request his permission for Every House to craft a performance out of and in response to a roughly 10-page selection from his 2008 book, The Presentable Art of Reading Absence. The selection includes a passage that we have come to refer to as the Three Matadors, rendered in a hybrid form combining poetry and the conventions of a stage play.
Nothing but memory now, the legacy of some prior disturbance. But that equation never serves. Someone is trying to phrase the Sparrows Lament.
In a long telephone call, Mr. Wright listened and spoke with absolute generosity. He became, or might I better say his voice became, for me, an instant teacher. Soon I received a letter granting permission, typed and signed by his wife, Lois.
For the project team, we assembled musician and writer Tim Kinsella to read the narration, Theater artist and dancer Sebastian Calderon Bentin, Matador 1. Dancer and choreographer Taisha Paget, Matador 2. And performance artist and musician Stephen Feen, Matador 3.
We commenced work on a performance, devising 4 original solos, each one accessing an aspect of the poetry, unfolding its complex weave. These solos operate as steps up to the high platform of the Matador's passage, which concludes the performance. The text has never been performed, Mr. Wright informed us.
What do we recognize in those 10 pages? A strand of poetry extends into a performance. Can we give those words that life? Can this effort define performance as we desire it, an alternate future of a work? These questions linked in our minds with those of our intergenerational team. We devise structures for these generations to gather around, and all things begin to weave for us. The poetry, the public, the creative haven that sits awkwardly in the market. In this imperfect world from which we cannot exempt ourselves, a future invites us in. To try to work that we may be worthy of what happens to us. That future that calls us like an unexpected wound, that internal future that we will carry, the future that will carry us.
Intergenerational communication as a public act in public space and time, that cobweb of intergenerationality collecting thoughts across memories, passed on like lace, unwieldy, inefficient, resisting virtuosity in competing rhythms, syncopated, at home in a public forum, not a private one, the two separated by a crumbling wall. We are part of that infrastructure with our 501c3 status. A bridge spans a river, sustained by dwindling public funds. Will they raise the gasoline tax? The crumbling concrete acts as a means, not an end, a conduit for human motion between riverbanks. What future do our actions presume? That the world will continue beyond today and continue in the direction in which our work nudges it. How can we explain what we are only now coming to understand? We know with certainty only what has unfolded inside us, if we can be forgiven that evocation of an interior, what has been caused to shift in inner landscapes. It's Act 1 of Chekhov's Three Sisters, and Vershinin makes a speech. You will not disappear without a trace. After you, there may appear perhaps 6 like you, then 12, and so on, until such as you form a majority. In 200 or 300 years, life on earth will be unimaginably beautiful. Man needs such a life, and though he hasn't got it yet, he must have a presentiment of it. Expect it. Dream of it. Prepare for it. For that he must see and know more than his father and grandfather. After which Masha says,
I'll stay to lunch.
If we choose to live as if in that future now, does it mean that we're living in our own private teleology? Will we always have it in us to care about the things about which we now care? Will our words, once heard, one day be heard again?
Moreover, the very meaning of survival becomes different. when we stop talking about the survival of something bounded by the skin and start to think of the survival of the system of ideas in circuit. The contents of the skin are randomized at death, and the pathways within the skin are randomized. But the ideas under further transformation may go on out into the world in books or works of art. Socrates as a bioenergetic individual is dead, but much of him still lives as a component in the contemporary ecology of ideas.
Randomized, a fine word. Pathways within the skin, a lovely image. Ideas, those we have tried to resist, to write around argument, pursuing the undeniable, the uncovered and recovered. We learned from our teachers, each of great stature, what disobedient students we were, insolent with expectation. Remember those days we knew nothing at all. That hardly matters now. We have outlived them, and in the morning we miss them. We write this, and we hear their voices, each with its own grain, this one soft, that one metallic. They speak our words back to us, more like music and without mercy. They stay with us beyond memory, to say what they think we mean and nothing more. A closing speech describes an impractical performance, a transmission from the future. The moment has arrived for us to refuse our exit, as they refused theirs. What was it that burned so brightly in them? We see it clearly now. It was the future. It was a future. Undiscovered country. They heard it. Its outcome neither predicted nor foretold, its meaning present. The future permitted their perfect ways of being. Their future that we echo called to them. In generations, it calls to us now.
Four performers enter with long arms. They sit at a table. The table extends beyond the ends of the room. They join hands and look forward. A chorus of 15 assembles. With mouths extended, they transmit messages clicking their tongues. 5 apparitions stand in the wings. They reach back to catch them and turn into topiary. The center of the stage vanishes, losing its navel. The topiary go down with it. A fistful of snow falls, and 2 yellow buses roll by. The 4 performers with long arms reach to the end. They whisper, "Come closer." The end bends down to them. Renegade time treads lightly over the stage. It does not sit still. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? So we have 15 minutes for, if that's okay with you. For questions and answers, and there's some lights.
If I could add something about that question and answer. It doesn't have to be a question. It could just be a comment or anything really that you feel like saying into a microphone in, in front of a room of semi-strangers.
You want Adrian?
I wonder if we could get lesbian killers out of the box again.
Ki-
maybe
lesbians
just
who kill.
metaphorically anyway,
Oh,
and to sort of come back to that moment where you're really discussing what might have been lost in this passage of Randolph Gallery, and I'm thinking about your reiteration and transformation of that long preamble that has a very weird warp temporality about it, and the kind of affects of languorousness and dissipation, as well as intense conviction and duty to the space and to community, and to a queer sense of community. And I was thinking if you could talk about your own different communities across the passage of your work, because what's so extraordinary, I think, about what you're doing now is that you've moved into a very different mode of community and mode of production of work. And you were previously in something that is a very different kind of modality of community, closer almost to the theatre troupe in a way. Something that is almost disappeared, I think, with a few exceptions of companies like Forced Entertainment or the Worcester Group, yourselves at the same time. So I'm wondering how you think about that kind of reformulation of your community of creation, and how it relates to our contemporary condition.
I don't know about that. I just one thing I wanted to say about the T-shirt was that for any of those of you who don't recognize that, that's from a Split Britches performance. It's called Lesbians Who Kill. Lois Weaver and Peggy Shaw made that show in 1992, the year of the pre-show announcement. So Mary Jo had, must have seen it and bought a T-shirt.
He's looking at me.
I didn't. This seemed like the question was in two halves, right? And so this is about the first half, which was that I think what I realize now for the first time in reading the paper was the conversation between that that announcement and what it brings forward of a sort of sense of, like the way you describe it, time and community and spaciousness of that moment, sort of the marginalia of, like, it wasn't the performance yet. It was just, a sort of accidental conversation that happened to be videotaped that really captures that time so well. The conversation between our trying to bring back the poetry of that and the feeling of that, and the passage that Lynn has about the reopening of the present, and the Leela Gandhi's ideas about inconsequentiality being. There's a kind of hesitation that's forced, or a kind of challenge or questioning of what is consequence, you know. And so it seemed like there was some conversation between those two, that the idea that you would go on that long before the thing that everybody's there to see, and nobody would mind. You know, it just seemed like that's what's sort of been like. There's some different sense of time, like, you know, of how much time we have for an event, or what constitutes an event, or what we expect when we go to an, like, you know, when it'll start and how fast it'll proceed. And so there's some sort of opening of that, you know, that sort of was at that time inconsequential to them, you know. But for us now, we seem to recognize the tremendous consequence of it. And so I guess that presumes something you're saying about community. And then the second half of the question about our formulation of our work. Did you want to talk about that? The Every House ethic?
Just quickly to say that Goat Island, the previous group, was together for 21 years in different configurations, but I would say that there was one group together for a long time, like 12 to 15 years. So now what we do is we gather for each piece teams of people who are really, I have to say, specialists, I think. In Every House Has a Door, the people that we bring together come with an aesthetic and a way of thinking that's one of the reasons they're there. Now with Goat Island, we would take a lot of time to develop something together. And now with Every House, we have just practically, we have shorter residencies to make a work. And the people that we come in, we respect incredibly as peers, with their own aesthetics oftentimes. And then we do have to come together and figure that out together. Even though, like, I mean, a prime example would be the band Joan of Arc, who is in one of our pieces. They made a whole song cycle. We made an album with them, but they were part of it. They're part of the performance. So, but that's true with the people. Stephen Feen, who's an incredible artist. Sebastian Calderon Bentin, Taisha Paget, who is in these people. Each are artists in their own right, and so we work with who they are and their aesthetic, and so and it's a different process, and I love the process actually. It's a different one, and it's one that it's more practical as far as time. We spend less. We come together for certain periods of time and then make a work from there. But I do think that this idea of not knowing or bewilderment still is that was part of Goat Island's process, and it's still part of Every House. Even, we come together, it's not like you just formulate it like math. There's still this place where I think all of us are wandering and trying to figure things out. And there's something that's very interesting about that process of not quite this process of unknowing, because it's almost like when you're wandering. I mean, Jay Wright, by the way, the poet Jay Wright we're working with now, does this in poetry. He's a wanderer in the landscape, in the wilderness at times of not knowing. And in that process, though, as a company and as an artist working, there is a funny thing about future with that, because when you don't know where you're going, it's almost like someone throws a ball at you. I mean, this could be definitely a false impression, but I have this feeling when I'm making work that it's like someone throws something at me from the future that I have to catch. It's because I don't know where I'm going, you know, or so it's a weird thing of when you get yourself in that state. And I think the other thing about Every House Has a Door is everybody's willing to be there with us in that state. And again, this could be constructed in some ways or a false impression, but I do, directing this, I do feel like something's being thrown at me at times, and I have to catch it, and it's coming from ahead of me. And then I have to watch it, and we have to watch it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
If I may. There's a question?
Yeah. Did you?
It's okay.
Go ahead.
Hi. There were many moments that were very moving for me, but because time is short, I'll ask about one, and that's the moment where you talked about abstraction, philosophy and abstraction. And
That was moving to you.
Oh, it's moving because it preoccupies me and it concerns me a great deal as someone who's reckoning with philosophy, academic philosophy also, as you may know. You were talking about the need for revising modes of abstraction and how abstraction is necessary to thought. It's inevitable to think without, you cannot think without abstraction. And what came to mind was this book by Thomas Nagel, The View from Nowhere. I don't know if you're familiar with it, which is a critique of philosophy, but it's also a critique of thinking and trying to open up the modes of abstraction that we engage in. And he offers there a whole spectrum of possibilities of abstraction, and at one end, there's the view from nowhere, which is also the view from no when, the end of the time difference and the possibilities of multiple times. And that's the absurd, it's Nagel's term, and meaninglessness, so the end of multiple meanings of time as well. He doesn't phrase it like that, but that's my interpretation. So and I think that's the point of, the abstraction that modern thought reaches, modernity reaches. So what I'm interested in is hearing what role this particular mode of abstraction, which is the most radical, the view from nowhere, the view from no when, plays in your work, even if any, or even if it's that which your work resists, which I seem to remember having seen, or at least projected into your Three Matadors performance that I saw in Chicago, at least.
A resistance.
A resistance to that radical abstraction. But there was that tension there that maybe I saw there, or I'm just projecting because I'm interested in this particular topic.
No, it's beautiful. That question does not need an answer at all. That was fantastic. It really, wasn't it?
I mean, it was.
We should applaud that question. I think you may be right that we resist that, but we won't anymore. Now that you've said that.
So, and I think like with that, there's also a time that actually exists, and it's imperative, which is a time for us to leave. I'm really sorry that maybe there are other questions, but I'd like just to thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. So.
Thank you.